The three abstract ways of pessimistic thinking. This absolute thinking towards setbacks is also the essence of pessimistic thinking. Seligman proposed that pessimistic thinking processes setbacks in three ways: permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. Let's start with the first absolute way: permanence. Permanence means thinking that something will happen forever in the time dimension. For example, if the company is busy lately and you have to work overtime frequently, you will naturally feel unhappy. How do you interpret this situation? You can tell yourself that work is busy lately, or you can say that this work is never ending. The difference between these two statements is that the first one limits the busy work to a certain time frame, which means that there is room for change after a period of time. However, the second statement judges the time of this state as permanent. Once you make something permanent, you cannot see any hope for change, and you will naturally become pessimistic and frustrated. Permanence in time also reflects in how we describe ourselves or others. For example, if you are tired because of frequent overtime, you can tell yourself that I am tired, or you can say I am useless. Tired is a temporary state, and it implies a solution. If you are tired, you can rest and recover. However, if you say I am useless, it is a permanent judgment, and there is no possibility of change. This kind of permanence also reflects in how we judge others. In my counseling room, quarreling couples often use the phrase "you always do this, you always do that." For example, the wife accuses the husband of only thinking about himself and not coming home every day. The husband responds, "I don't always not come home. I just have occasional social events. And you always make a fuss and are unreasonable." Always is a statement of permanence in time. At this point, I would ask them, are there any exceptions? Are there times when the husband comes home early, or when the wife is considerate of him? If there are, then you cannot say always. The second absolute way of pessimistic thinking is pervasiveness. Pervasiveness means extending the unreliability of one man to all men. If someone is unfair to me, then the whole world is unfair to me. The example of Paul we mentioned earlier, who thought that the work in this startup company was bad and extended it to all work, is an example of pervasiveness. The third absolute way of pessimistic thinking is personification. Personification means thinking that all bad things are directed towards oneself and are one's own fault, which leads to the occurrence of these bad things. Let me give you an example. A friend of mine once consulted me about his job. He worked in the finance industry as a salesperson and had to make calls to many clients every day to recommend their financial products. These clients were not very enthusiastic about phone sales, some politely declined, and some hung up as soon as they heard it was a sales call. He became depressed and believed that he was annoying and that was why he was rejected, and that he was useless. This is a form of personification. I asked him, "Do those people who receive your calls know who you are?" He said no, some of them hung up after hearing just 2 words, "Hello." I asked, "What about your colleagues?" He said they were about the same. I said, "Since they don't know who you are, and since your colleagues have similar experiences, why do you think it's directed towards you? Those people have their own needs, and they don't want to be disturbed. This is understandable, but if you think it's all directed towards you and it's all your fault, then you're overthinking it." He thought about it and said, "It seems so." Later, to remind himself, he made a card that said, "It's not my fault." From then on, he wouldn't feel so depressed when he was rejected on the phone. When problems arise, thinking it's all directed towards me and it's all my fault is a common psychological reaction. Perhaps you've seen a movie scene like this, where the protagonist encounters a stroke of bad luck and shouts at the sky, "God, why are you targeting me? What did I do wrong?" This is a form of personification. We often have a strange sense of guilt when bad things happen, and sometimes even when we are the victims, we still feel it's our fault. This expands our defense range, but also makes us fall into unnecessary guilt and self-blame. Looking back, the biggest problem with absolute thinking is that, in order to defend against possible dangers, it closes life in a vacuum, making us afraid to face reality and thus losing the opportunity to heal from reality and life. Like a dog with depression, it could easily jump out of the cage with a light leap, but it no longer dares to try. If life is a river, absolute thinking turns life into a sourceless water. This is the biggest problem with absolute thinking. In these few lessons, we talked about 3 types of defensive thinking: rigid thinking, should thinking, and absolute thinking. These 3 ways of thinking seem different, but they are actually closely related. For example, when parents praise a child for being smart, it is an abstract evaluation that can trap the child in a self-proving trap. The child will work hard to maintain their image and avoid challenges. This is rigid thinking. Then the child will develop this way of thinking: I should appear smart, otherwise no one will like me anymore. This is should thinking. Then, if the child doesn't do well in something, like failing a test, they will think, I can't even pass a test, which proves that I'm not smart enough, and there's no point in doing anything else. This is absolute thinking. Therefore, rigid thinking, should thinking, and absolute thinking usually occur simultaneously. Their core characteristic is that they use abstract thinking to prevent us from connecting with reality. You may be curious about what to do if you have defensive thinking. Don't worry, we'll talk about this in the next lesson. See you in the next lesson.